Salutations, fellow interweb dwellers. I must confess, I didn't actually play Star Wars Outlaws, and I will not be playing it. I'm not gonna spend $70 on it, and I'm not gonna waste precious hours of my finite existence meandering around the empty, unfinished open world that comprises like 80% of the game. The only experience I have with the contents of this game are from vicariously watching my friend, actually Andrew, suffer through it, and that's enough for me, thank you very much. So since it's something I haven't actually played, I'm not gonna spend that much time talking about it. I'm only going to discuss aspects of the gameplay that I know for a fact are a feature, like the fact that the game purports itself to be a choose-your-own-adventure type story that allows you to basically create your own destiny. You can interact with characters in different ways that'll theoretically produce different outcomes and consequences, though in reality it's basically just a linear story path with a thinly veiled illusion of choice. This is a game that steadfastly refuses to let your character do anything that might be considered even slightly immoral. You're not allowed to fire your weapons on random people. It literally just won't give you the option to do that, or for that matter, fire on anyone at all that isn't an Imperial or skeevy outlaw. And the main character you're playing as, Kay Vess, isn't really a character at all. She basically doesn't have any agency or perspective about anything other than the very cookie-cutter, we should help people because being mean is not nice. Which, I mean, you can make your story's protagonist a strictly good person. You know, no one's stopping you from doing that. But that gets a bit frustrating when this is a game called Star Wars Outlaws, and the whole selling point is that you get to navigate through the criminal underworld and deal with a bunch of powerful crime syndicates. This is a story that's ripe with all sorts of interesting potential and set at a point in the timeline where the galaxy is at its most chaotic, what with a full-scale war happening right now between the Rebellion and the Empire. But you're only allowed to do that in the most moral way possible, and that just gets really annoying after a while. I want to play as a scoundrel type who does under-the-table work for Jabba the Hutt. I don't want my only interaction with him throughout the entire game to be me rescuing my cutesy pet sidekick from him after someone else gambled him away from me. But this game is only the most recent example of this. Fans have been frustrated with Star Wars games for quite a while now, and I remember the main point of contention was with the 2017 Battlefront game when that came out. This was a game that advertised the fallout of the Battle of Endor in the final year of the Galactic Civil War, told from the perspective of a band of Imperial loyalists. The tone of the trailer implies that the Empire's out for blood after the death of their Emperor, and while they may be severely weakened, they have no intention of going quietly. You get the implication that you'll be playing as members of Inferno Squad throughout the game as you undergo missions to destroy the Rebellion before they can fully cement their rise to power, but that's not what we got at all. One of the members of the squadron stays evil the entire game, sure, but the two main characters we follow most of the time defect pretty much at the beginning of the story, and the reason for why is really dumb. I don't necessarily blame this game for the existence of Operation Cinder, because that was first introduced in the Aftermath trilogy by Chuck Wendig, which for better and most certainly for worse, this game's story is trying to operate in tandem with, since it covers the same span of the timeline and deals with the same general conflict. But as far as I'm aware, nobody forced the game developers to incorporate this as the main driving factor for our protagonist to join the Rebellion. It's a really stupid contingency that's absolutely not within character for Palpatine to come up with, that entails the destruction of the Empire alongside the Rebellion in the wake of his death. The essential idea here being, if I'm dead, the Empire doesn't deserve to continue on, which is just not something you'd think Palpatine would concern himself with, but it makes it extra funny when you remember that he apparently also had a contingency in place that would allow him to come back to life. These things seem to contradict each other, buddy. But either way, that's beside the point. What I'm getting at is that this game was not at all what EA promised it to be, both from a gameplay perspective and also from a story one. And it naturally frustrated a lot of fans who wanted what the trailers advertised. We as the audience understand the Empire are the bad guys, but that doesn't deter us from wanting to play as them, and I see no reason why they can't just give us that. There's a simple fix to this that I've recently been giving a lot of thought to, which is that you could just fundamentally rewrite the conflict of the story by building it off of a scene that's already there. A scene that I actually like quite a bit. Early on in the game, Del Meeko, the secondary protagonist and love interest to Iden, meets Luke Skywalker while on a mission to destroy a vault full of priceless artifacts the Emperor owned. Once again, I guess now that Palpatine is dead, he just wants those things to stop existing. Dude, why do you care? But anyway, Luke is there to collect a compass that'll totally be relevant in The Last Jedi, just trust me, bro. And when he sees Del is in trouble, he comes over and saves him. Del obviously recognizes who this guy is and understands that he's basically the face of the Rebellion at this point. So to him, it's confusing that someone who's supposed to be his enemy would go out of his way to keep him from harm, something he didn't have to do.
I know who you are. Why'd you help me? because you asked.
Naturally, this exchange causes Del to start questioning a few things, including a lot of the propaganda he was fed as a child about what the Jedi were and who exactly it was feeding him that propaganda.
I've heard 100 stories about the Jedi. They terrified me as a boy on Coruscant, but you... Why would the Emperor have a vault that can only be opened using the Force?
Why do you think?
You're telling me the man who destroyed the Jedi Order was secretly one of them?
No. I'm telling you that as a boy on Coruscant, you were frightened of the wrong thing.
And, of course, the conclusion to this is Del realizing a change needs to be made. He knows what the Empire has done and can't fully condone it, but he's always seen it like there isn't any alternative.
I'm not blind. I know what the Empire is capable of, but what else is there?
A choice?
The rebellion?
No. A choice to be better.
This is, and I seriously mean this, the best depiction of Luke Skywalker we've ever gotten on screen since the Disney acquisition. The sequels assassinated him, the Mandoverse doesn't understand him and also assassinated him, Rebels doesn't count. We haven't gotten very good representation of this character under the Disney umbrella, so even though this small part of an otherwise mid-game is really nothing to write home about, it's basically peak Luke under Disney. God, how sad is that? But all the same, I really like this part of the game, and I think if you simply rework the story so that Del is the only one of the team to defect after being inspired by Luke's words here, then that gets rid of the Operation Cinder bullshit and instantly generates a much more compelling conflict. Iden and Del are theoretically really close characters who would have had a strong relationship built up in the first act of the story, so that it's all the more heartbreaking when they find themselves on opposing sides of this war due to ideological differences that they just can't get past. They deeply care about one another and don't want to hurt each other, but eventually it's going to come down to that because neither of them is willing to yield on their principles. Imagine a version of this game where Del is technically in the right morally, but he's framed as the antagonist because you're playing as an Imperial diehard who feels like she was betrayed by the man she loved. Suffice it to say, we haven't been eating good on the game front since Disney took over, and that's not an unpopular opinion. I mean, really, we just haven't gotten very many of them, and the ones we have gotten are nothing exceptional or particularly mold-breaking. Like, I like the Jedi games, don't get me wrong, but they fall into the same problem we just went over. A Jedi character helping out the rebellion? Okay. There's nothing wrong with that, and I think the stories are fine, but I'm still craving a game where you get to navigate through the world as a less than scrupulous protagonist. Both Battlefront and Outlaws could have been the perfect outlet for that, but they both fell short. And it just makes me think about some of the older games that really let you run wild with the direction your character takes. I recently played through the remaster of Bounty Hunter, and it's not like that game particularly did anything new or exciting, but you at least get to play as an amoral bounty hunter, and at no point does Jango Fett commit to any one side. He does whatever job he's paid to do, and if it means gunning down an entire facility of prisoners and guards to do it, then he will. But the games aren't the only part of Star Wars that have this problem. I actually first noticed this when Season 1 of Loki came out, and they immediately regressed all of what made Loki such a good character in the Avengers into this washed-out goody two-shoes after watching a fucking highlight reel of somebody else's life. So I wouldn't say it's a problem specific to Star Wars, and it's more just broadly a rule that Disney seems to have when making their shows, which is that the main character absolutely has to be a good guy no matter what. Andor seems to be kind of teetering on the edge by exploring moral grayness when and where they can get away with it, but only because the Disney execs know the main character to be that rebel hero from Rogue One who helped steal the Death Star plans. They didn't really pay much attention to Andor while it was being made. That's why it was actually allowed to be creative and tell a good story. But that aside, I can obviously see why Disney would want to have this rule for their streaming shows. They've always tried to present themselves as a family-friendly company, and these shows are going to be put on the same platform as things like Toy Story, or The Lion King, or Frozen, movies that are made to appeal to young children, and they want the people paying for their kids to watch those movies to feel safe in the knowledge that little Timmy isn't going to click on the new Star Wars show and see the main character do something mean. And it's kind of a double-edged sword where they're happy to inherit more violent shows like Daredevil or The Punisher and put those on their streaming service because people really like them and they know they'll make a lot of money by doing it. But if it can be helped, any of the stuff they put on there needs to be as squeaky clean as possible, which unfortunately isn't a mindset that really lends itself creatively to a show about Boba Fett, for instance. The Book of Boba Fett was marketed as this gritty, Sopranos-esque crime thriller where Boba tries to establish himself as the head of a criminal empire while recovering all of Jabba's territory. And ostensibly, that's sort of what the show's about, At first, anyway. They never really develop the Hutt cartel and their interest in Tatooine. Jabba's cousins show up and try to make a claim for it, but then they fail one assassination attempt and just give up, and then they're never seen again. The real antagonistic force of this season is the Pikes, but not because they're a warring crime faction who are trying to undermine Boba's grasp on his territories. They're the bad guys on the show because they're drug dealers? What? For some reason, even though Boba is now a crime boss and even refers to himself as one,
I'm the crime lord, he's supposed to pay me.
he really doesn't like the fact that the Pikes are selling spice on Tatooine. And it's not because he himself is trying to cut into the spice trade and doesn't want rival dealers on his turf or anything like that. He doesn't want them doing it because drugs are bad.
Pike Syndicate are mustering troops in Mos Espa. They have slowly absorbed our planet as part of their spice trade. I will vanquish these interlopers who threaten our planet. I will make the streets safe again.
Every action Boba takes throughout this story is in the name of trying to protect Tatooine and make it a safe, prosperous society. But not to make it easier for him to maintain a seat of power, he does it because he's just such a swell guy and he really wants to help people, by George. And I've said in past videos when talking about the show that you can give Boba Fett an arc and turn him into a heroic character if you want to do that. You know, there's room for that sort of development, and as long as it's done well, I won't criticize it from a writing standpoint. It wasn't done well, in case you were wondering, but that's not the point. But looking at the meta, I am forced to ask what the point was of giving Boba Fett his own show if you're not going to make him act like, well, Boba Fett. Where's the ruthless pragmatist from the OT whose only real motivation was gold? You know, where's the man with no name Clint Eastwood figure that made audiences fall in love with the character in the first place? Like, I'm not stupid. I obviously understand that the reason they did this was because they know Boba Fett is a popular character who's bound to pull in some views if they make a show and slap his name on it, even if they don't even bother to feature him for like 2 out of the 7 episodes. But I just don't understand what they expected to happen when they took away the stuff that made people like the character to begin with. And even before this, The Mandalorian was originally advertised to be a show that explored the everyday world of the Star Wars galaxy from the perspective of a Boba Fett type nomad warrior. But by the end of the very first episode, he'd already found himself a cutesy little traveling companion to protect, and by the end of episode 3, he'd officially decided to take Grogu on as his charge. At the time, a lot of fans were disappointed because we'd been expecting to finally have a show with a protagonist who wasn't strictly morally good or bad. He was just a guy trying to get by in a lawless galaxy, and then they had him commit to one side and stick to it for the entire rest of the series. Despite this, though, many people were, and still are, fond of this show, and it was only like the second time Disney had done this, so way more people were willing to forgive it back then. We figured we'd get the thing we were asking for eventually, so just accept The Mandalorian for what it is and see what the next show brings. But it's been 5 years, and we're still waiting! And I feel like this is where a lot of you are gonna come in and say that Star Wars has always been a simple story about good versus evil, light versus dark, yada yada yada. There's nothing morally complex about the conflict in the original trilogy, and so I'm just complaining because the franchise isn't going in the direction that I personally want it to go. And, well, I challenge the notion that the original movies aren't morally complex, but I take your meaning. Those movies did have a very clear good guys and bad guys, and they weren't necessarily trying to overcomplicate it beyond what was necessary to convey those themes. They are fairly simple and straightforward movies. But I'm a big believer in a franchise growing past its initial roots if it's gonna stick around in the limelight for 50 fucking years. And like it or not, Star Wars isn't going anywhere anytime soon. And for the original movies that were trying to tell a massive story on a broad scale, you can get away with simplicity. But if you're trying to market your shows as a glimpse into the smaller scale world of Star Wars, then things have to be more complicated than light side versus dark side. Your average Han Solo type or Cassian Andor or fucking Max Rebo characters don't give a single fuck about the Force. They don't know anything about the light or the dark, only what exists right in front of them. And of course, what they do with the reality in which they find themselves is entirely dependent on who they are. Cassian is always gonna join the cause because he can only run from the conflict for so long. Han is always gonna help the rebellion because Luke and Obi-Wan are always gonna walk into that cantina. But not every character is a Cassian. Not every seedy smuggler is a Han. Some people do bad things for good reasons. Some do them just because they want to, or because there's financial incentive. There's all kinds of stories you can tell, with a vast array of characters and aliens and cultures to choose from, that I simply don't understand why it's always limited to the same good versus bad and the main character must always be good kind of shit. I'm sick of seeing it, and I know I'm not alone. And you can have your cake and eat it too in this case. There are plenty of shows out there that focus on the good guys doing good guy things, and no one is saying you have to stop making those. Just give us a little variety. That's all. Anyway, I think that about does it. I wanted to get another short man out while I continue to churn away at my script for the Attack of the Clones video I promised you all months ago. I can't give a real time frame for when that's coming out, but I'm shooting for November, December at the latest, hopefully. Frankly, I'd wanted it out by now, but it was kind of a busy and chaotic summer, and I ended up getting distracted by a lot of different things I wanted to talk about. But it's coming. And then after that, 2025 is going to be a packed year, so who knows how busy I'm going to be by then. In any case, thank you all so much for watching. If you liked this video, there's plenty more where it came from right here on this channel, and linked below are all the various other ways you can follow and support me if you feel so inclined. And if not, just know that I have ways of tracking you. That's it for today. See you again soon.